So of course our story begins with Gregor Mendel. We've gone over Gregor Mendel, the Austrian monk, who was fond of growing plants and studying their inheritance patterns. Most specifically, he was working with pea plants, and he would grow and record the inheritance patterns within these peas. He was able to control the mating of these peas, and he was able to carefully control which varieties would be mated with which other varieties. And he could examine their offspring and take very careful notes about these offspring being produced and the inheritance patterns being produced. So, on to the Mendelian paradox. So Mendel continued to do these studies and find these results that we've been examining so far. And in doing so, he was able to record many of these results, and he finally published them in 1865 in what is now his famous publication about the hybridization in pea plants. Now, along came Ronald Fisher, who was a geneticist in the early 1900s, and he's also a very renowned statistician. And he began to study Mendel's work as part of his studies as a geneticist. In doing so, though, he came across a couple of disturbing things. And the first thing was that from his estimations in statistics was that the results were more perfect than one would expect it. The chance that you'd get such good results and such results that matched the theoretical expectations was, he estimated, about 1 in 33,000, which is pretty unlikely. And secondly, when Mendel was examining the dominant offspring produced in the F2 generation, he correctly discovered and reported a ratio of 2 to 1 for heterozygotes to homozygous dominant offspring. However, it turns out that the expectation really is that he should have had that a little bit wrong by making certain mistakes that don't seem to have been made. He should have probably found about a 1.7 to 1 ratio in his data by just natural error. And this is because he only did test crosses on 10 offspring per experiment. Now recall, a test cross is what we use to verify whether a dominant phenotype, such as this purple flower here, is generated by the homozygous dominant genotype or the heterozygous genotype. And you can review your lecture notes to see how this works out in terms of producing different versions of offspring for the different conditions. Now in Mendel's case, simply by chance, he should have misidentified some of the untested progeny as heterozygotes when they were actually homozygous dominant. And so he only tested 10 offspring per experiment. The rest of them would have been prone to error. Nevertheless, he reported results showing a 2 to 1 ratio from his results, which is a very unlikely result. So as a result of his findings, Fisher called Mendel's results into question, and he simply suggested that perhaps some manipulation of data might have been done, or at least at minimum some unfaithful reporting had been taken place in the publication. Now the paradox of this is that Mendel was known to be of high moral character. He was very careful and detailed in all aspects of his life, not just his science, but in his financial dealings and other aspects as well. And he had been shown to have been reporting strange results in studies of other plants, and so why would he report them there and not in the studies of the peas? So it's somewhat out of character for Mendel to have done some unfaithful reporting or done some data manipulation on purpose. So this creates the paradox that we want to study in this week's lab. So in this lab, we're going to work in small groups through an essay on the Mendelian paradox that was written by Moto Nisani. And we're going to evaluate some aspects of scientific ethics as we do this, and perhaps try to evaluate some of the reasons that Mendel's data might have come out in this surprising manner. And then finally, you and your group will conclude what were Mendel's actions about and what can we conclude more generally about reporting scientific results in general. So in closing, just want to remind you that to participate in this week's lab, you're going to have completed this video, which apparently you've done, and then you're going to bring your completed worksheet to the lab along with the laboratory handout or the reading on the Mendelian paradox.